We both want to wish the Lionesses the best of luck for tonight. You've done amazingly well in the competition and we're rooting for you all the way.
Good luck, I hope you win.
It happened just minutes ago, a revelation no one expected from a girl who has spent her entire life under a shadow she never asked to inherit. For the first time, Princess Charlotte has broken her silence about the grandmother she never met, and with 4 quiet words, "I finally understand now, the monarchy may never be the same again." The moment the silence broke. It happened just after 7:30 on a cold January morning, the kind of winter dawn where the sky hangs low and colorless over Windsor, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Inside the private apartments of the Wales household, where routine usually functions like a protective shield, something shifted with the subtlety of a tremor and the magnitude of an earthquake. It began with a simple conversation, one meant to be gentle, reflective, something William and Catherine hoped would anchor their children before another long day of lessons. Instead, it delivered a revelation that no one in the monarchy was prepared to confront. Princess Charlotte, seated quietly at the edge of the small sitting room, had been tracing the embroidered pattern of a cushion with absent fingertips. She looked peaceful, even contemplative. But beneath her stillness, something had been building, accumulating quietly, gathering weight like the pressure behind a winter storm that waits for the exact moment to break. And when it did, her voice was barely more than a breath. "I finally understand now." The room fell so silent that even the ticking of the antique mantel clock seemed to hesitate. Catherine turned first instinctively, as mothers do. William looked up moments later, his expression shifting from gentle curiosity to something deeper and far more fragile. For a heartbeat, they both wondered whether they had misheard her, whether those 4 quiet words had carried the meaning they feared. But Charlotte lifted her gaze and met theirs directly, and in her eyes they saw a clarity that did not belong to a child of 9 years, but to someone who had glimpsed a truth far larger than herself, a truth shaped by a woman she had never met, but whose shadow she had felt since the moment she entered the world. Princess Diana. Outside, frost clung to the stone balustrades. Guards marched their predictable paths in thick gloves and winter coats. But inside that small room, time folded in on itself as William's breath caught in his chest. He had spent years preparing for the day his daughter would ask about Diana. He had rehearsed words, softened edges of painful memories, and imagined the moment arriving when he could explain the grandmother who had shaped his life in both love and tragedy. But he had not prepared for this. He had not prepared for understanding to arrive unprompted, without question, without preface. He had not prepared for Charlotte to come carrying her own conclusion. Catherine reached for her daughter's hand, steady but shaken. "Tell me what you understand, sweetheart." But Charlotte shook her head gently. Not with fear, not with confusion, with certainty. The certainty of someone who had crossed an invisible line between childhood innocence and the beginning of awareness. Senior aides would later recall how the energy of the household changed that morning with a swiftness that felt startling. One staff member described it as the air tightening. Another said everyone seemed to be walking more carefully, as if the walls had suddenly become fragile. The truth was simpler. William's daughter had spoken a sentence that reopened an old wound in the monarchy, a wound that had never fully healed. Within an hour, a confidential memo had been prepared for the palace's internal family liaison team, the same group responsible for monitoring emotional well-being within the royal household. The memo never leaked, but those who saw it described its tone as unusually somber. It documented precisely 6 words. Princess Charlotte expressed independent awareness of the late Princess of Wales this morning. It also noted that William requested a pause in all upcoming engagements that placed him in front of Diana-related media. The reaction among senior advisors was immediate, though behind closed doors. Diana remains a gravitational force in the monarchy's story, a legacy that pulls, shapes, distorts, and magnifies every decision William makes. That legacy has touched his marriage, his public role, his conflict with Harry, and his relationship with the press. But for years, the family had believed they could protect the next generation from its heaviest shadow. They believed they could keep Diana a presence, not a burden, a memory, not a myth. But children feel the truth before adults explain it. And that morning, Princess Charlotte had felt something shift inside herself that no one had anticipated. As the winter light slowly brightened outside their windows, William stood from his chair and walked to the far side of the room, pausing beside a framed photograph of Diana placed discreetly on a shelf. It was one of the few pictures he kept in this part of the apartment, a private one, taken in the early 1990s. Diana's smile was luminous, the kind that softened every space it entered. William looked at it for a long moment, the weight of memory thickening in his chest. Charlotte watched him carefully, silently, the threads of understanding knitting together in her expression. And Catherine, witnessing the shift between them, felt a quiet ache settle in her heart. This was the moment every parent fears, the one where the world becomes just a little larger, a little sharper for their child. It was in that stillness, that breath between grief and revelation, that a truth became undeniable. Princess Charlotte was no longer merely the granddaughter of a legend. She had stepped willingly, instinctively into the legacy Diana left behind. And the monarchy, already bracing under the weight of winter uncertainty, would soon understand that those 4 words spoken by a girl of 9 would echo far beyond the walls of Windsor. I finally understand now. And nothing in the royal family would be the same again. The quiet build-up, signs. No one noticed until now. In the days that followed Princess Charlotte's quiet revelation, it became painfully clear to those closest to the Wales household that understanding does not strike like lightning. It gathers slowly. It forms quietly. And when it finally surfaces, it appears sudden only to those who are not watching closely enough. But in truth, the signs had been there for months, perhaps longer, woven into the shifting rhythms of Charlotte's world. Subtle hints, lingering questions, new silences, small tremors that went unnoticed until her 4 quiet words on a January morning turned them into a map of inevitability. It began in late autumn, during a period when the royal household was adjusting to the growing pressures surrounding King Charles's health and the increased expectations placed on William. Catherine, functioning as both mother and stabilizing presence, had been guiding the children through their school routines while managing the palace's delicate winter calendar. During one afternoon briefing, a senior advisor mentioned the upcoming preparations for a Diana Memorial segment that would accompany a charity anniversary in early February. The comment was casual, almost incidental, but Charlotte heard it. She had been seated across the room coloring quietly, her attention seemingly fixed on the page. Yet her hand stopped for a fraction of a second, the crayon hovering above the paper. Catherine noticed the pause, just barely, but she assumed it was nothing more than a child's wandering attention. In hindsight, she would remember that hesitation with an ache. A daughter listening for the name of a grandmother she had never known. Around the same time, palace tutors who assisted the children with history and social studies began noticing a new pattern. Charlotte had always been inquisitive, thoughtful, drawn to stories of the past, not for their dates or details, but for their emotional weight. She asked why people made certain choices. She asked what happened after events ended. But in November, something shifted. Her questions became sharper, more purposeful. One tutor recalled her asking quietly, "Why do people talk about Grandma Diana differently in different countries?" It was a question unusual for a girl of her age. Most children ask who or what or when. Charlotte had asked why. The tutor answered gently, explaining how public figures can be remembered in different ways by different cultures. But the question lingered. It marked the beginning of Charlotte's deeper awareness of the divide between the world inside palace walls and the world outside them. Meanwhile, William had been receiving increasingly frequent briefings about a troubling trend resurfacing in American media. News outlets, especially those catering to older viewers who remembered the 1980s and 1990s vividly, were drawing more frequent parallels between Princess Charlotte and Princess Diana. It began with harmless commentary about mannerisms, a tilt of the head, a shy smile, a glance captured by photographers that reminded viewers of Diana's early years. But soon the conversation expanded into more symbolic territory. "The next generation echoes the past," one commentator declared during a late-night segment, And whether the palace likes it or not, public imagination will place Diana's legacy on the shoulders of this young girl. The palace disliked it very much. William's reaction was immediate and protective. He requested limits on press access during family outings, increased media monitoring of commentary relating to Charlotte, and a temporary halt to cross-generational comparisons in palace-approved materials. But the press behaves like the tide. You can slow the waves, you cannot stop the ocean. Charlotte felt those waves long before anyone realized she was standing close enough to the shoreline to sense their pull. Another sign appeared in the form of a school assignment. Each child had been asked to select a historical figure who had influenced modern Britain. George chose a wartime leader. Louis picked a famous explorer. Charlotte initially refused to choose. She told her teacher she did not know yet. That alone was unusual. Then, 2 weeks later, she quietly submitted her assignment. She had chosen Princess Diana. When the teacher shared this with Catherine, she did so carefully, knowing how delicate the subject was. Catherine listened with a calm expression, but her fingers tightened around the folder she was holding. She thanked the teacher, but her mind was already racing. No photographs of Diana were used in the assignment. No emotional language, only a simple sentence written in Charlotte's neat handwriting. She helped people feel seen. It was the kind of insight one does not expect from a 9-year-old. It was the kind of truth that had taken adults years to articulate. Then there were the glances. Those quiet moments when Charlotte would linger by the framed photographs of Diana placed discreetly throughout the private residence. Some were candid, some were formal. One in particular showed Diana seated on a bench in the gardens at Kensington Palace, sunlight falling across her face. Charlotte paused at that photo more than the others. Catherine noticed. William noticed. Neither spoke of it aloud. But perhaps the clearest sign came in December during a visit to the Spencer family estate. The children had accompanied William briefly, a tradition he continued quietly to ensure they knew their heritage beyond the monarchy. As they walked the grounds, Charlotte stopped before a small stone monument dedicated to Diana's memory. She did not speak. She simply stood there, hands clasped in front of her, eyes steady and searching. William called her name softly. She turned toward him, but her gaze drifted back to the stone. Something had settled inside her that day. A recognition, a question, a truth that had not yet formed into words but had already taken root. And so when Charlotte finally spoke on that cold January morning, when she looked at her parents with clear, steady eyes and said, "I finally understand now," the palace was shocked. The public was unprepared. But the signs, quiet and delicate as they were, had been gathering for months. The only people who did not see them were those who wanted to believe she was still untouched by the legacy waiting for her. But children, especially royal children, grow up faster than anyone wishes. And Charlotte, without anyone noticing, had already begun walking toward the shadow Diana left behind. The trigger. What Charlotte saw, read, or overheard. No moment of understanding arrives without a spark, and though the palace would later dissect this period with almost forensic precision, the exact trigger behind Princess Charlotte's quiet revelation was not a single event, but the collision of several truths arriving at once. The Wales household, accustomed to guarding its children from the harsher edges of royal existence, had underestimated how swiftly a child's intuition could gather meaning from pieces adults believed they had hidden. And somewhere in the weeks leading to that January morning, Charlotte encountered something that clarified the shadowy outline of her grandmother into a figure she could finally recognize. It began innocently, almost forgettably, with an archival image displayed during an educational module at school. The lesson had been about modern British history, and the teacher, attempting to illustrate the evolution of public service roles, included a slide featuring Princess Diana greeting hospital patients in the early 1990s. The photograph depicted Diana bending down, gloved, surrounded by flowers and soft smiles. Charlotte's classmates saw a historical figure. Charlotte saw a face she had grown up hearing about but never truly knowing. The teacher moved quickly through the slides, unaware that one child in the room was staring long after the lesson had shifted topics. Later, that teacher would say that Charlotte had gone unusually quiet for the rest of the day, though she asked no questions and made no comments. She simply carried the image home with her, tucked somewhere behind her steady, reflective expression. The second spark arrived days later, and it came not through a classroom but through a corridor. Catherine had been in discussion with a senior advisor regarding preparations for an upcoming charity initiative. The advisor, believing the children were out of earshot, mentioned that the February segment honoring Diana required adjustments due to the sensitivities surrounding King Charles's health. He spoke softly, respectfully, but the mention of Diana's name in relation to the present, not the past, was enough to catch Charlotte's attention. She had paused just beyond the threshold, small and unseen, listening to words not meant for her, but carrying meaning she was ready to receive. Catherine later realized that the timing of that overheard conversation aligned almost perfectly with the shift she noticed in her daughter's demeanor. More stillness, more thoughtfulness, a different kind of listening. But none of these moments alone explained understanding. That came with the third spark, the one the palace tried most to keep from reaching the children. In early January, an American network aired a retrospective on Diana in anticipation of the upcoming charity anniversary. The segment was emotional, atmospheric, and focused heavily on the global resonance Diana still held, especially among American viewers over 50. The Palace communications team had anticipated increased media chatter, but they had not anticipated the clips circulating on digital platforms viewed by millions, including some of Charlotte's schoolmates. Someone had mentioned it to her at lunch, describing Diana as a woman who tried to change the world and paid for it with her life. The phrasing was childish, dramatic, and entirely inaccurate, but it lodged in Charlotte's mind like a seed. That afternoon, she asked Catherine softly whether the world had been kind to Diana. It was the first direct question she had ever asked about her grandmother. Catherine answered gently, offering a measured truth that balanced compassion with protection. But Charlotte did not look fully satisfied. Her eyes held a searching quality, as though waiting for a truth she sensed existed beyond the adult version she had been given. The final trigger, the one the palace identified as the true catalyst, came during a quiet evening in the library at Adelaide Cottage. William had been reviewing old documents, including a bound collection of speeches Diana delivered throughout the 1980s and 1990s. He intended to move them to a more secure location, but before he did, he paused at one of her most famous lines. "Carry out a random act of kindness with no expectation of reward." He whispered the line aloud, unaware that Charlotte had entered the room to retrieve a book she needed for school. She froze in place, listening. William, sensing movement, turned and saw her. He closed the book slowly, intending to steer the moment toward a gentle explanation. But before he could speak, Charlotte asked, "Did she say that because she knew people were not kind to her?" William felt the air shift. It was a question so small in sound, yet so devastating in implication. He lifted her into his lap, choosing his words with the care of someone balancing memory with legacy, truth with the need to protect. He explained that Diana believed deeply in kindness, that she thought it had the power to lift the unseen and the forgotten. Charlotte listened, quiet and intent, but William noticed the way her gaze drifted to the book's cover. He recognized that look. It was the same gaze he had once given his mother when he was a child, trying to understand the world she moved through. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, William confided in Catherine that Charlotte was beginning to piece together the emotional history surrounding Diana with an accuracy that was both remarkable and heartbreaking. Catherine agreed. She mentioned the photograph at school, the overheard conversation, the retrospective circulating on American platforms, the question at lunch. It was not one spark, it was all of them, converging at once. Senior advisors eventually compiled these events into a briefing document meant strictly for internal review. They titled it Emergent Legacy Awareness Patterns. It outlined how Charlotte had been exposed to a constellation of influences, each small, each seemingly harmless, but collectively powerful enough to illuminate the silhouette of Diana's life in a way no one intended. The document circulated quietly among the highest levels of the palace. One advisor described its tone as urgent. Another described it as mournful. It became clear that Charlotte had not stumbled upon understanding. She had been walking toward it slowly, quietly, guided by the fragments of a story she had inherited by birthright. And when those fragments finally aligned, her revelation did not arrive as shock or panic, but as clarity. I finally understand now. It was not a declaration of grief. It was a recognition of legacy. A legacy that had found its way to her not through scandal or spectacle, but through truth-seeking instincts that mirrored the grandmother she never met. And from that moment forward, nothing inside the Wales household would ever feel quite the same. Inside Kensington, the family reckoning. In the days after Charlotte's quiet declaration, the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace shifted in a way that those closest to the family felt immediately, though none dared to mention it aloud. The palace had weathered countless moments of tension, from constitutional crises to personal reckonings, yet there was something uniquely fragile about this one. A 9-year-old child had awakened to a truth that the monarchy itself had spent decades attempting to balance delicately, and now that truth had reached the surface, not through scandal, not through headlines, but through innocence. Innocence that no longer shielded her from the legacy awaiting her. It was Anne who arrived first, summoned not by formal request, but by instinct sharpened across a lifetime of royal duty. She entered through the quieter west entrance of the palace, her coat dusted with the remnants of winter frost, her stride purposeful and unhesitating. Those who witnessed her arrival later described her expression as one of solemn comprehension, as though she understood the weight of this moment before anyone explained the details. Anne had lived through the decades of turbulence that followed Diana's ascent and loss. She had seen how the world shaped narratives around women in the monarchy. She knew exactly what it meant for a child to speak the words I finally understand now. William greeted his aunt in the private drawing room. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the ornate carpet. For a moment, neither spoke. It was not silence born of discomfort, but of recognition. The kind that exists only between two people who understand what it means for history to repeat itself in ways too painful to name. Finally, Anne took a seat, removed her gloves, and said in her steady, unfaltering voice, "Tell me everything." William explained the events of the past week, the school assignment, the overheard conversation, the retrospective from the American networks, the question about whether the world had been kind to Diana, and finally the moment in the sitting room when Charlotte voiced her understanding with a calmness that broke something open inside him. As he spoke, Anne listened without interruption. Only once did her gaze move toward the framed photographs on the mantel. Diana's eyes, frozen in time, seemed to meet hers. When William finished, Anne leaned back and exhaled slowly. "This was always going to come," she said softly, though her tone carried an edge of firmness. "You cannot shield children from legacy, not one like hers. But we must guide her, we must keep her grounded, not myth-bound." She had always been Diana's quiet counterbalance, unmoved by spectacle, unimpressed by public myth-making, and deeply protective of the institution. Yet even she understood the emotional reality unfolding. A young girl discovering the grandmother whose absence had shaped the life of everyone in this family. Moments later, Catherine entered the room. Her expression carried both tenderness and fatigue, the kind that accompanies the work of shielding a child from storms they do not yet fully understand. She sank into the seat beside William, her hand brushing against his, seeking a steadiness they were both struggling to maintain. She recounted her conversation with Charlotte earlier that morning, the way Charlotte spoke with a clarity beyond her years, asking questions that had no easy answers. "Does understanding always make things hurt?" she had asked her mother. And Catherine, feeling the ache of a question too heavy for childhood, answered as gently as she could. "Understanding makes us see things more clearly, and sometimes that clarity asks us to be brave." Anne's expression softened, though her resolve remained firm. She spoke about duty, about the weight of public expectation, about the way legacy can be both anchor and burden. William sat quietly, absorbing her words, recognizing the truth in them, yet resisting the inevitability they carried. He did not want his daughter defined by echoes of a past she never experienced. He did not want her name tied to the same cycles of fascination and intrusion that had once consumed his mother. But the world does not always offer choices, especially not to those born into crowns. The discussion deepened when a senior advisor entered with a confidential briefing. He explained that several networks in the United States were already preparing Diana-related features for the February charity anniversary. Some included speculation about the next generation. Others drew parallels between Charlotte and Diana with an intimacy that made William's jaw tighten. The advisor mentioned that public sentiment among American viewers over 50 was rising sharply, especially after recent commentary suggesting that Diana's legacy might find its successor in Charlotte. The advisor left the room moments later, but the tension he carried remained. It was Camilla's reaction, however, that altered the emotional tone of the reckoning. When she arrived that afternoon, her approach was quieter than usual, deliberate, measured. She had lived through the decades-long storm of Diana's public memory, had been shaped by it, wounded by it, and forced repeatedly to rebuild herself in its shadow. She understood better than anyone how powerful Diana's legacy remained, even now. Camilla listened carefully as Catherine explained Charlotte's awakening. A complicated expression crossed her face, a mixture of empathy, caution, and the keen awareness of someone who knew that Diana's story was never confined to the past. She placed a hand gently on Catherine's arm and said, "The world will want to make her into a symbol. You must protect her from that. Let her understand Diana the person, not Diana the myth." It was the most unexpected advice she could have offered. And yet, it was the truest. As the winter light faded outside, the conversation continued for hours. They discussed boundaries for the media, guidance for Charlotte's teachers, adjustments to the upcoming anniversary plans, and the emotional support Charlotte would need as her awareness deepened. Through it all, William remained silent more often than he spoke, turning over thoughts too tangled to articulate. When the meeting finally ended, he walked down the quiet corridor alone. The portraits lining the walls watched him as he passed, history framed in gold leaf, legacy in every brushstroke, and there, near the end of the hall, hung a portrait of his mother. He paused before it, the familiar ache rising, steady and sharp. This, he realized, was the beginning of a new chapter, one where his daughter would no longer be protected from Diana's legacy, but shaped by it. One where understanding would ask more of her than he was ready to give. And as he stood in that dim corridor, illuminated by the soft glow of winter lamps, he whispered a promise he hoped he could keep. "She will know you by truth, not by tragedy," because his daughter had spoken 4 quiet words, and the monarchy would spend years reckoning with them. Charlotte's words, and what they really mean. In the days following Charlotte's startling revelation, the phrase she spoke lingered through the private spaces of the monarchy like a quiet echo that no one could silence. "I finally understand now." 4 words, softly delivered, yet powerful enough to unsettle the very architecture of a family long accustomed to burying its most painful truths beneath centuries of precedent. The question that rose immediately within the palace was simple but impossible to avoid. What exactly did she understand? For William, the realization came slowly and painfully. His daughter was beginning to grasp not the details of Diana's life, not the historical facts nor the public narrative, but the emotional truth that had shaped his entire existence. A truth children rarely recognize this early: that love can be brilliant and broken at the same time, that fame can give and take in equal measure, that a woman can be adored by millions yet left unprotected when she needed it most. Charlotte had begun to see the outline of this contradiction even before she had been capable of naming it. Advisors tasked with monitoring the Wales children's well-being prepared internal assessments that read more like reflections than formal reports. They observed that Charlotte's comprehension was not rooted in trauma nor fear, but in empathy. She had begun connecting the fragments she had gathered through school assignments, overheard conversations, and subtle family patterns. She had sensed the weight her father carried, the way photographers sometimes approached them with a hunger that did not feel innocent, the sudden hush in a room whenever Diana's name was mentioned. Children notice what adults hope they do not. And Charlotte, in her gentle perceptiveness, had noticed everything. The palace found itself confronting a new kind of question. Not how to protect Charlotte from Diana's legacy, but how to ensure she understood it truthfully, without myth-making or magnification. The world outside could not be controlled. Not the American networks preparing documentaries for February. Not the commentators reminding their audiences that Diana's spirit lived on in the next generation. Not the older viewers who saw in Charlotte a familiar blend of independence and tenderness and declared it destiny rather than coincidence. What the palace could control was the truth offered within its walls. Catherine felt this responsibility most acutely. She had spent the past decade raising her children with an intentional gentleness, creating stability where past generations had felt instability, nurturing emotional openness where previous heirs had been taught restraint. Yet she also understood the danger of allowing a child to inherit a legacy that could devour her if left unchecked. So Catherine began preparing quiet, age-appropriate explanations for Charlotte. Stories not about Diana the icon, but Diana the woman, a mother who loved deeply, a daughter who struggled with a world that rarely offered her safety, a figure shaped by compassion long before she was shaped by cameras. Meanwhile, the emotional implications of Charlotte's statement for William were far more profound. He had spent his entire adult life negotiating the space between his mother's memory and the monarchy's expectations. For years, he had tried to protect his children from the pressures that once defined his childhood. He had tried to separate them from the noise, to give them a childhood not dictated by flashbulbs or public projections. But now, faced with Charlotte's quiet awakening, he felt a fear he had not anticipated, that the story of Diana, no matter how gently delivered, would pull his daughter into a version of the past he had fought to leave behind. A private conversation between William and a senior advisor captured the emotional truth of this moment. William admitted that hearing Charlotte's words felt like watching history open its eyes, not as nostalgia, not as tragedy, but as inheritance. And inheritance, he understood better than anyone, is never simple within the monarchy. International reaction only intensified the emotional weight. In the United States, older viewers who had followed Diana's life in real time treated Charlotte's awakening as symbolic. Several commentators described it as the moment Diana's story reached across generations. Others speculated irresponsibly that Charlotte might one day become a modern version of her grandmother. The palace bristled at this suggestion, aware of the damage that kind of narrative could inflict on a child so young. British analysts, more cautious, focused on what this meant for William's role as future king. They saw Charlotte's statement as a reminder that Diana's legacy still shaped the public's understanding of the monarchy, even nearly 3 decades after her loss. But inside the palace, removed from commentary and speculation, a simpler truth unfolded. Charlotte's words were not a prophecy. They were not a political warning nor a challenge to the crown. They were the expression of a child who had sensed the emotional pulse of the family she belonged to. A family forever split between duty and memory, between tradition and loss, between the life Diana lived and the life she never had the chance to finish. By speaking those words, Charlotte had not revived Diana's legacy. She had acknowledged it. She had recognized that understanding is not inherited through stories alone. It forms through empathy, through instinct, through a child's quiet observation of the adults around her. And that recognition, pure and unguarded, held more power than any headline ever could. Because for the first time, Diana's legacy was no longer something William carried alone. His daughter had stepped into the emotional history he had spent years trying to navigate, and though it frightened him, it also offered something unexpected. The possibility that understanding, when rooted in love rather than myth, might become the very thing that heals. The future Diana never saw a legacy passed forward. In the quiet aftermath of Charlotte's awakening, the Wales household entered a period of reflection unlike anything they had experienced before. Not a crisis, not a media storm, but a turning of the tide, gentle yet irreversible. For years, William and Catherine had worked to craft a childhood untouched by the harsher elements of royal life. They had protected their children from the world's gaze with the determination of parents who knew too well the consequences of growing up under scrutiny. Yet now, they found themselves facing the truth that some legacies drift toward their heirs, no matter how carefully the doors are locked. It began with a single sentence spoken by a child. "I finally understand now." 4 words that Diana herself never heard from the daughter-in-law she never met, or the grandchildren she never held. Yet their meaning echoed through the palace corridors with the weight of history. Diana's legacy had crossed into a new generation, not through spectacle nor expectation, but through empathy. And empathy, once awakened, cannot be unlearned. William spent those early days walking thoughtfully through the private gardens of Windsor, retracing paths he once walked as a boy alongside the mother he lost. Staff who saw him from a distance described his posture as reflective, almost solemn but steadier than before. He later confided in a close advisor that Charlotte's awakening had stirred something he had spent years keeping tightly guarded, a mixture of grief, pride, and fear. Grief for what he had lost, pride for the daughter who understood more than he expected, and fear that the world might try to shape her into something she was never meant to be. Catherine approached the moment differently. Her instinct was gentle preparation. She curated small, meaningful stories to help Charlotte build a human understanding of Diana. Not Diana the icon, not Diana the tragedy, but Diana the mother. The young teacher in the nursery, the woman who laughed with her sons, who found joy in kindness, who once said she wanted to be remembered for touching lives rather than holding titles. Catherine wanted her daughter to inherit truth rather than myth, grounding rather than pressure. Anne, ever pragmatic, offered advice rooted in decades of navigating the monarchy's inner storms. She told William and Catherine that legacy is only a burden when it is left unexplained. A child who understands it through honesty will carry it with strength rather than fear. Her words resonated deeply, especially for William, who had learned the cost of silence when he was too young to demand answers. In the wider world, reactions continued to grow. American outlets discussed Charlotte with reverence. British commentators noted her emerging composure, speculating quietly about the role she may one day play. But the palace reinforced strict boundaries, refusing to allow narratives to form around a child still discovering who she is. Their priority was not public fascination, it was protection. And yet, despite their efforts, something had shifted. Charlotte had stepped into a story Diana never lived to see. The future of the monarchy she once challenged, reshaped, and illuminated. A future carried now not by pressure, but by understanding. A future where a young girl recognized the humanity of the grandmother, whose life shaped her father's heart. On one of the final nights of January, after the palace had settled into its winter stillness, Charlotte approached Catherine with a thought that revealed just how deeply her understanding had rooted. She said softly, "I think she wanted people to feel less alone. Is that why everyone still talks about her?" Catherine pulled her daughter close, feeling the tenderness of the question settle between them. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered, "that is exactly why." And in that small exchange, the legacy Diana never saw was passed forward with a gentleness she never received. Because now, in the hands of a child who speaks softly and listens deeply, Diana's memory is not a wound, it is a light, and Princess Charlotte, without ever meaning to, has become its keeper. And so we return to the moment that began all of this. A quiet January morning. A 9-year-old girl. 4 words spoken with a clarity that rippled through the walls of a monarchy still learning how to live with the legacy of the woman it lost. I finally understand now. In that single sentence, Princess Charlotte did what no advisor, no documentary, no commemorative speech has ever been able to do. She bridged a generational chasm not through duty or expectation, but through empathy. And empathy, as Diana knew all too well, is the most powerful inheritance any of them could receive. What unfolds next for Charlotte will not be defined by the world's desire to cast her as a reflection of the grandmother she never met. It will be shaped by the truth she carries, the gentleness she observes in her mother, the strength she witnesses in her father, and the grounding guidance of the family determined to protect her from becoming a symbol before she becomes herself. Diana's legacy has always been complex, brilliant, painful, and uncontainable. But perhaps its most beautiful chapter is the one being written now in quieter rooms, in softer moments, in the understanding of a child who feels deeply and sees clearly. The monarchy may weather new crises. The world may continue to debate, remember, and reinterpret the life of the woman who changed everything. But here, in this moment, Princess Charlotte has offered something rare. A reminder that legacy endures not only in history books or public memory, but in the hearts of those who choose to understand it. And for the first time, Diana's story is not just being carried forward, it is being honored.